Back in the Great Depression, the U.S. government rolled out the New Deal. It was this huge, sweeping set of programs meant to pull the entire country back from total collapse. It was a massive experiment in federal power, promising relief, recovery, and reform. But hidden inside that experiment was another, much more radical promise.
And this was it. For the very first time, the federal government made an explicit top-down promise of racial equality. I mean, look at this executive order from FDR. It was crystal clear, no discrimination on any grounds. That was a huge deal for the 1930s.
But, a promise made in Washington, D.C. is one thing. What happens when that promise gets out into the real world, when it lands on the desks of thousands of local relief boards all across the country, each with its own politics, its own pressures? Did that promise actually hold up?
To figure that out, researchers dug into a real treasure trove, the complete 1940 census data. They looked at over 1,000 counties, and what they found wasn't one America. No, it was like they were looking at two completely different countries, each with a shockingly different story to tell. And this is where it gets really visual. On the map, you can see green spots where black men had better access to relief jobs, and red spots where they had worse. And the graph next to it? Well, it just makes that divide undeniable. You've got one story for the South and a totally different one for everywhere else.
Let's start with the South. The numbers are pretty grim. Only 24% of black men lived in counties where they had an equal, let alone better, chance at getting one of these crucial relief jobs compared to white men in the same boat. Just 24%. But now, look at this. In the Midwest, that number just skyrockets. An incredible 94% of black men lived in counties where their access to relief was as good as or even better than that of similar white men. The difference is it's staggering. So, what in the world was going on here? How could the exact same federal policy lead to such completely opposite results? Well, the answer, it turns out, is a tangled mix of local economics and local power. All right, first up, let's follow the money. Because this wasn't just about simple prejudice. A lot of it came down to pure economic self-interest. Things like jobs, resources, and competition played a huge role in whether a community decided to follow the federal rule or just ignore it. Okay, to get this, we need a super quick economics lesson on two ideas: complements and substitutes. Think of it like this. Substitutes are like two baristas competing for the same shift. Complements are the barista and the pastry chef. They aren't competing. Their jobs actually help each other out. And that's exactly what played out on the ground. In places where black and white men did similar jobs, they were substitutes. The competition for those relief jobs was fierce, and discrimination got way worse for black men. But in counties where they had different complementary jobs, white business owners actually supported relief for black workers. Why? To make sure their labor force stuck around for when the economy picked back up. It also boiled down to just plain old resources. Basically, where there was more money to go around, in wealthier counties or places with more tax revenue or that got more federal money, that intense competition just eased up. When the pie is bigger, there's less of a fight over who gets a slice. So economics is a huge piece of the puzzle, but it's not the whole story. To really get the full picture, you have to look at power. Who is actually in charge of handing out these jobs, and what kind of political pressure were they under? And the data here gives us something of a smoking gun. It breaks down all these different local factors and shows us exactly which ones move the needle on whether black men got a fair shot. It's a really powerful look at what actually tipped the scales. So, let's see what helped. Access was better where the black community had more organization and influence, like a long-standing NAACP chapter. As we just saw, it also helped when black and white workers weren't competing for the same jobs. And, pretty fascinating, access was also better where there was a larger share of foreign-born white residents, maybe because they were also facing discrimination, which kind of shifted the local power dynamics. And what hurt access? Well, a higher black population often stoked fears among white voters about competition over resources. A local history of lynching was obviously a sign of deep-seated racial hostility. And, in a weird twist of irony, another New Deal program, the AAA, actually made things worse by paying landowners not to farm, which pushed a lot of black sharecroppers off the land and into the already crowded lines for relief jobs. Okay, so where does all this leave us? What's the final verdict on the New Deal's big promise? Well, it is definitely not a simple pass or fail. The reality is way more complicated and, honestly, pretty contradictory. And this is where it gets really strange.
Outside the South, black men were much more likely to be unemployed in the first place. You know, the whole last hired, first fired thing? But if they were unemployed, they were actually more likely to get a relief job. Now flip to the South. Unemployment rates between black and white men were pretty similar. But unemployed black men were way less likely to get relief. It's like two different worlds operating under the same policy.
So you see, calling the federal promise a simple failure just doesn't capture it. It was a fractured reality. In a huge part of the country, it was actively sabotaged by local interests. But in other places, against all odds, that promise was actually met, and sometimes even exceeded.
When you boil it all down, one thing becomes crystal clear. It all came down to local control. The New Deal depended on local officials to actually run its programs. And that local control acted like a filter, turning one single federal policy into thousands of different outcomes based on whatever the local economics, power structures, and racial politics happened to be.
And this isn't just some dusty history lesson. This story, from almost a century ago, holds some incredibly powerful lessons about how government policy actually works, or doesn't work, in the real world even today.
Here's the big takeaway from the New Deal's experiment. You can have the best designed national policy with the best intentions in the world, but its ultimate success or failure is almost always decided on the ground, in thousands of individual communities. That tension between federal goals and local reality is constant.
And that leaves us with a question that's just as sharp today as it was back then. When the federal government makes a grand promise of equality, but it's local power that holds the purse strings, who really gets to decide what that promise is worth?